Hello, this is Michael Paul with New Orleans Scottish Rite College. I'd like to do a video today on early Louisiana Freemasonry. Now, one of the best ways that we can look at the history of any Grand Lodge is to look at their proceedings. They give you an idea of what they did for any particular year. The problem with early Louisiana Masonry is that so many of the early proceedings simply do not exist. I don't mean that they were never written or published. I mean that they were destroyed, either accidentally or deliberately. It was a most difficult time in the mid-1800s for the whole of Louisiana Masonry. It's now clear that some aspects were felt by some to be better lost than remembered. I find that sort of thinking as un-Masonic. What I find even more un-Masonic is the fact that it is very possible that some of the early history of Louisiana Masonry was deliberately destroyed. If we destroy history, then we destroy who we are. No matter how we feel about our past, we have no right to attempt to change reality. That makes us dishonest, and for historians, it makes them the worst kind of historians. If it turns out that evidence is discovered to establish that records were deliberately destroyed regarding early Louisiana Masonic history, then I will have nothing but contempt for those who have done such a thing. What I would like to look at today is the oldest surviving complete proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. This is the 1818-1819 proceedings. It's only a 6-page document, but it contains some very interesting bits of information. This is the first page of the oldest known existing and complete proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. There is a copy of the excerpts of the 1812 proceedings creating the Grand Lodge, and we will cover that in the next video. This proceedings covers the transition from Louis Moreau Lillet, or Lillet, as Grand Master in 1818 to J.B. Modeste Lefevre as Grand Master in 1819. Now, being only 6 pages, we know right off the bat that the proceedings is not exactly filled to the brim with details. We know that a lot is simply not there, but we can still learn a good deal of interesting information from what is present. For example, this quarterly communication held by the Grand Lodge was held the day after Christmas. I find that very interesting and dedicated. What I also find interesting is that while it says that the meeting was held in New Orleans, the exact location is not provided. The 333 St. Charles Avenue location, where several Masonic temples were built, was not used until the 1850s. Prior to that time, the Grand Lodge must have met in one of the area lodges. The only clue most often given in the existing early proceedings is that the Grand Lodge met at the hall of their sittings. That's not exactly specific. In looking through the existing pre-1850 proceedings, we can, however, pick up a few clues. We can see that the first meeting of the Grand Lodge, the meeting creating the Grand Lodge, was held in Perfect Union Lodge. At that time, Perfect Union met at the corner of Camp and Gravier Streets. They would later move to Rampart Street, a few blocks from Etoile. But can we understand the phrase, hall of their sittings, to mean Perfect Union? Well, page 9 of the 1828 proceedings reads, the Grand Lodge met at the hall of Polar Star, its usual place of sitting, at the hour of 11:30 a.m., and was opened by the Grand Master in ample form. So, was Etoile the hall of their sittings? Well, from the 1845 proceedings, we then read, the Grand Lodge holds its meetings in New Orleans at Perseverance Lodge number 4, corner of St. Claude and St. Anne Streets. So the only thing that makes any sense is that until the Grand Lodge had its own building, it rotated between the several New Orleans area lodges. Maybe they had some internal method for selecting which lodge hall would be used for the Grand Lodge meetings, but it's just not made clear in the proceedings. Another thing that is not stated, but becomes apparent on page 3, is that this December 26 communication was for the installation of the Grand Lodge officers. They were elected at a previous communication in November, and then installed at this communication. Reading this first page by itself, however, leads the reader to assume that the election was held on December 26th. The second page also contains some very interesting bits of information, but is also a bit confusing. In the second paragraph, it speaks of the election of officers for the ensuing year and gives the names of those elected. Reading this paragraph and following the first page speaking of this December 26th communication, it seems to confirm that this is when the election took place. Regardless of any confusion on when the election took place, the list of new officers provides some interesting information. One of the most common phrases that I've heard in Masonry when asked why something is being done is, because it has always been done that way. Well, not always. The titles associated with the Grand Lodge officers is an example. Today, the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana is titled Most Worshipful Grand Master. Prior to 1850, however, the office of Grand Master was known as Right Worshipful Grand Master. It's possible that this is the result of 4 of the 5 lodges that created the Grand Lodge in 1812 holding charters from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, the Grand Master is known as the Right Worshipful Grand Master. By the 1830s, the title changed, but just a bit. The office of Grand Master was known as the Right Worshipful Grand Master, but when speaking of the Grand Master himself, it became known as Most Worshipful Brother, and then his name. But in addition to how the Grand Master was addressed, other differences are shown. Today, the Grand Wardens of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana are the Grand Junior Warden and Grand Senior Warden. Until 1850, however, they were the Junior Grand Warden and Senior Grand Warden. The same is true for the Grand Deacons. In addition, today only the elected Grand Lodge officers are known as Right Worshipful. This excludes the Grand Master and any past Grand Masters who might be serving as the Grand Secretary or Grand Treasurer. They are still addressed as Most Worshipful. But prior to 1850, all elected and appointed officers were Right Worshipful. Like so many other things, this changed in Louisiana after 1850. Exactly why it changed is not clear. But what I also find interesting is that following the name of each Mason, elected or appointed, is his occupation. This is not done today, and I'm not sure why it was done at that time. But it does clarify a rather important point. In later years, some Masonic history books have attempted to downplay the qualifications of the early officers of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. Suggestions have been made that they were unskilled, naive, unsophisticated, and not exactly high-quality individuals. A quick look of the Grand Lodge officers shows that, in addition to merchants, we find attorneys, physicians, and even the mayor of the city of New Orleans. In 1818, the Grand Master was one of the authors of the Louisiana Civil Code that is still in use today. These were not intellectually deficient individuals. I believe it is very clear that they would have been highly respected wherever they chose to live. Now we see page 3 of the Proceedings. The first 2 paragraphs of page 3 create a bit of a confusing situation. They seem to be suggesting that the installation of the Grand Lodge officers were held in November of 1818, with the first 2 pages of the Proceedings seeming to suggest that the election was held on December 26th. It's just not possible that the installation would be held a month prior to the election. It seems safe to say that the election was held on November 10th, with the installation on December 26th. What is also interesting is the appointment of the Grand Deacons. Today, the Grand Master makes all the appointments. In the 3rd paragraph, it states that the Right Worshipful Grand Master and the Right Worshipful Senior Grand Warden appointed the Senior and Junior Grand Deacons. Then in the 4th paragraph, it states that the Right Worshipful Grand Secretary appointed a Deputy Grand Secretary. The 5th paragraph begins with the nominations for various committees. I find it interesting that rather than simply saying that the Grand Master appointed the committees, special note seems to be made that the ones appointed were nominated by the Grand Lodge. It seems that there was a spreading out of the authority. Page 4 of the Proceedings continues with committees that were appointed, but then goes into a list of the active members of the Grand Lodge. This list is most interesting as it highlights what would become a very controversial Masonic political decision made by the Grand Lodge in 1850. Today, the active members of the Grand Lodge are the three principal officers of each lodge, the Grand Lodge officers, and the past Grand Masters. But prior to 1850, past masters of all the constituent lodges were also considered active members of the Grand Lodge with voting rights. The turmoil of the mid-1800s has been covered in other videos and may be covered again in later videos, but for this video, it is sufficient to say that the decision to remove past masters from active membership was a move to assure that the new 1850s element in the Grand Lodge was not outvoted. It seems that it was a purely political decision. Regardless, prior to 1850, past masters were considered an active part of the Grand Lodge. Now, one more interesting thing about this page. You will notice that about 2/3 of the way down the page is what seems to be a smudging out of a name. In many of the old documents, we can find smudges and letters covered up by discolored paper or flecks of paper covering words. In this case, however, the smudges seem to have been deliberate, and someone's name seems to have been covered up. We'll come back to this name removal on the last page. Page 5 of the Proceedings begins with the last names on the list of the active members of the Grand Lodge. Then it goes to the lodges represented at the Grand Lodge communication. You will notice that Charity Lodge number 2 is not represented. Charity Lodge would cease to exist just a few years after this proceedings, about 1821. Another lodge not represented at this communication was Friendship Lodge number 6. Friendship Lodge was organized in 1813 in Mobile, Alabama, and ceased to exist around the same time as Charity. Additionally, Lodges number 7, 8, and 9 would also not survive long. Lodge number 7 was chartered by the Grand Lodge of Louisiana in Havana, Cuba in 1815 and turned in its charter in 1820. Lodge number 8 was chartered by the Grand Lodge in Veracruz, Mexico in 1816. This lodge ceased to exist soon after this Grand Lodge communication was held. Lodge number 9 was chartered by the Grand Lodge in Campeche, Mexico on the Yucatan Peninsula in 1817. It ceased to exist also around 1821. The Louisiana Lodge created in Mobile is very interesting, but I find the lodges created in Cuba and Mexico even more interesting. Louisiana did have a very close relationship with Freemasonry in both Cuba and Mexico for many years. Page 6 of the Proceedings continues the list of lodges, with Lodge number 10 chartered in 1817 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, number 11 in 1818 in Matanzas, Cuba, number 12 in 1818 in Donaldsonville, Louisiana, number 13 in 1818 in Natchitoches, Louisiana, and number 14, again in 1818, in Havana, Cuba. It looks to be a busy time for the Grand Lodge chartering lodges, especially outside the U.S. In the next few years, a few more lodges were chartered in both Cuba and Mexico, and also Alabama. It seems that none of these lodges lasted a very long time, at least under the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. The page ends with the printed names of those expelled from the Grand Lodge. The proceedings are then attested to with the signature of the Grand Secretary, but it is not quite finished. There is a handwritten note at the bottom of the page that is very interesting. The note is signed by the Grand Secretary. Now, if you remember on page 4, there was what looked like a name smudged out towards the bottom of the page. Well, it turns out that that name was smudged out. The handwriting is difficult to read, but a close examination of it reads, "The Grand Lodge in its sitting of the 9th of March, 58, and it's not legible. Maybe 16 as in 1816, but I'm not sure. I simply can't make out the final date. But it goes on to say, has resolved that the name of Dominique maybe Rouguette, and I'm not sure of that spelling, but Shelby Raisin. Raisin is an antiquated word meaning erased. Clearly, this individual did something to cause his expulsion, or at least a removal from the list of active members of the Grand Lodge. I can find no similar name in any of the later existing Grand Lodge proceedings, and the earlier ones don't exist. Whoever he was, and whatever he did, his name is gone. I hope that this video gave you some new insights into the early days of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. In our next video, we'll take a look at the existing extracts of the June 20th, 1812 meeting creating the Grand Lodge of Louisiana and some of the meetings leading up to that creation. It should prove most interesting. Thank you for watching. If you like the videos, please hit the like button and subscribe to us. See you next time.